To do a provisional cast on for 1x1 rib, make a slip knot in a piece of scrap yarn and put the scrap yarn onto a crochet hook that's about the same size as the needles that you want to cast onto. Now take one needle and you're going to hold the needle in your left hand and you're going to tension the working yarn. Like, see, I've got this little tail on my scrap yarn and then I've got plenty of working yarn to cast on with. And you're going to tension the working yarn in your left hand. Now this is the same as a regular provisional cast on, just with a couple extra tricks to help make it easier for 1x1 rib. Alright, so you've got your slip knot on the crochet hook and the yarn is going to come underneath the knitting needle like so. Now stabilize the yarn here with the knitting needle. Now reach with the crochet hook over the top of the knitting needle and around the back of the yarn and take a loop of yarn and bring it with the crochet hook through the loop that's already on the crochet hook and adjust that loop of yarn so that it's onto the body of the crochet hook. So now we've cast it on one stitch onto the needle. Stabilize the needle in your right hand and move the yarn between the crochet hook and the needle back to the back of the needle. And like I said, this is the same as a regular crochet provisional cast on. We're going to get to the trick in just a minute. And I have a video that shows this exact technique in more detail. So do a regular crochet provisional cast on. Repeat those same movements that I just showed you at the beginning. And I'm just going to cast on 5 stitches. That's all you really need to get the idea here. And then you can move the yarn between the needle and the crochet hook. And we're done with the provisional cast on. So what you want to do now, you can take the crochet hook out. You don't need it anymore. And if you want, you can put a stitch marker into this loop right here so that it doesn't fall out. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't have one. I don't have one near me. Alright, so this is the trick we're going to do. What you want to do is take your working yarn, this is the yarn that you're going to use for your actual project, and tension it in your hands to knit, whether you knit continental style or American style. I can show you American style if you want. Just leave your tail hanging down about 5 or 6 inches, hanging down, and tension your yarn as if to knit. So I know we're going to be working in 1x1 rib here, but the trick in this case is you can knit all the stitches or you can purl all the stitches, but just don't work in 1x1 rib on the first row. Okay, so take up a loop of yarn, like knit that first stitch, knit the second stitch. Like I said, if you want, you can purl them all, it doesn't matter. Just make sure that you work the very first row in all the same stitch. This is going to help you so much when it's time to take out the provisional cast on. When you're ready to seam it up or do whatever you're going to do with it, you are going to love it. It's just going to pull right out like magic. Okay, so now that you've got your first row of working yarn done, we don't want to lose this tail, so make sure that tail doesn't go anywhere and give it a nice tug. Okay, now you can turn your work, and now on the second row you can begin to work in 1x1 rib and knit your project, and then I'll show you the last part of the trick once I've got a few rows knitted. So we're going to work in ribbing now. When you've knitted as far as you want to on your project, you're going to want to take your provisional cast on, yes, it changed color, and put it onto a double pointed or a circular needle. Now the first thing to look at is, see this tail of yarn right here? This makes an important loop that you're going to want, especially if you're going to use Kitchener stitch to graft your 1x1 ribbing together. Okay, so what you're going to want to do, you actually want to take out your marker and you want to pull the first loop out and just get rid of that first tail right there, and you're going to want to preserve this loop of yarn like that. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is take a tapestry needle and put this tail onto the tapestry needle, and then use the tapestry needle to weave the tail in along the side so that you preserve this. It's sort of a half stitch right here. Okay, so just tuck your tapestry needle down here, and I'm not gonna disguise this very much. I'm just gonna go straight down so I can see exactly what's going on here. Okay, you can weave in this tail as carefully as you want, using whatever technique you want, but I just want to go straight down so I can see what's going on. So we've preserved that half of a loop right there, and now we want to pick all these loops up with the circular needle or a double pointed needle. So I've got one end of my circular needle here, and we've got the right side of the work facing us. Now, you know, ribbing is sort of double-sided, but this is going to be the side that I'm going to have facing me when I start the grafting, because it starts with a knit stitch here. So we just turn everything upside down like this, and then go from right to left, and we're going to go in each stitch from front to back, from back to front, and before we take the waste yarn out. So we'll go into that first stitch from back to front, and now we can start to undo the waste yarn here, and just take a look at each. Here we can even prepare it a little bit just so that it's easier to take out when it's time. Take these little chains out. Okay, now we've got our provisional stitches here, the turquoise ones. Okay, now look at each stitch, and we're going to go in each stitch from back to front, and then slip the waste yarn out of that one stitch. Here we have another stitch here, and we're going to go in from back to front. So turn it like this and go with your needle from back to front. So we want to orient each of the stitches as if it's a regularly oriented knit stitch, okay? We don't want any backward stitches. And keep going like this from back to front, and then pull the waste yarn out, and then we have a couple more loops here. This last loop, or second to last loop, go in from back to front, pull the waste yarn out, and here we have our yarn that has our slip knot. I'm just going to pull and take the slip knot out, and this is our last loop here. It's basically a half loop. We want to go in here from back to front as well, and then pull the waste yarn out, and we've got 6 correctly oriented stitches on the needle. Now, to seam this up with Kitchener stitch, you're going to turn the knitting around again and put the needle with the working yarn on it in front and the provisional stitches in the back. And see why I wanted to leave this other tail really obvious, so I can actually tighten up that loop. This is a loop we made, the first loop we made. Tighten that up so it doesn't get too loose. So one thing to note is that we've got 5 stitches on the front of our work and 6 stitches, or 6 loops anyway, on the back of our work. This is going to make your Kitchener 1x1 rib graft come out perfectly, and it's going to be like this perfect seamless tube, but only if you set it up correctly like this, okay? So there are 4 full stitches and 2 half stitches, one on either side, and that's going to make your Kitchener stitch come out perfect. And the other thing to note here is that this is top to bottom grafting. Okay, this is the top of your work, that was the bottom, and we're combining these two. This would not work if we were going to fold these top stitches in half, for instance, and graft the top to the top. Okay, that's a different technique, and you can look that up on interweave.com. So now you're going to take your tapestry needle, and we want to cut the tail yarn here at least 3 times the width of your stitches. Here it's very small in this case, plus another 6 inches for weaving in, and I'm going to leave a little bit more just to have some room to maneuver, just because 3 times the width of 5 stitches is really nothing at all. But that's what you need, at least that much, okay? You can always do more and cut it or pull a lot of tail through, you know, if it's bothering you. Better to have too much than too little. So to do Kitchener stitch on 1x1 rib, I'm going to show you the sequence that we feed the yarn in through the front and back stitches, and the direction that you're going to feed them through. It's different than regular Kitchener stitch, but not too different, okay? So the sequence that we're going to go in with our tapestry needle through these stitches is front, back, back, front. So the first stitch on the front needle, the first stitch on the back needle, the second stitch on the back needle, and then back to the first stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the direction that we're going to go, actually before I tell you the direction, I will also say that we're going to leave the first stitch on, take the first stitch on the back needle off, leave the second stitch on the back needle on, and then take that first stitch on the front needle off as we go. As you may know with Kitchener stitch, you feed the yarn through, and either you take the stitch off onto the yarn or you leave it on the needle. And the case here is leave on, which is different than regular Kitchener stitch. Leave on, take off, leave on, take off. Now the only other thing you need to remember is which direction to go in through the stitch, and that only depends on whether it's a knit stitch or a purl stitch. So here I'm starting with a knit stitch, and the sequence for knit stitch, it goes purl, purl, knit, knit. It's whatever's opposite to the knit stitch, to the kind of stitch that it is. So we're going to go in purlwise, and we don't have any setup stitches whatsoever here. We're just going to go straight in purlwise with that tail yarn, and then don't take the stitch off the needle. Come back to the back needle, and we're going to go again in purlwise, purl, purl, and then this stitch does come off that back needle, like that. Then we go knitwise and leave the stitch on, going in knitwise into that. Oops, we don't want the yarn to go around the needle, just underneath. Knitwise, and then knitwise again onto the front needle, and then that's going to come off as we go. You can go in knitwise and then take it off, or do it all in one movement. And we're going to pull a little snug, not too snug. It's easy to do too snug, okay? So similar sequence, but this time, since this is a purl stitch, we're going to go knitwise, knitwise, purl, purlwise. Knitwise, and the stitch stays on the needle. Knitwise, the stitch comes off the needle. Purlwise, the stitch stays on. And keeping your yarn below the needles here, we're going to go in purlwise again, and this time the stitch comes off. There we go. Alright, so we've done 2 stitches. Let's keep going. This is a knit stitch, so we're going to go purlwise, purlwise, knitwise, knitwise. Purlwise, the stitch stays on. Purlwise, the stitch comes off. And it's pretty easy to do it in one movement rather than 2. Knitwise, the stitch stays on. And then knitwise, the stitch comes off. Alright, we're doing good. And you can always check and see how you're doing, especially it's obvious on the knit stitches, right? We're doing great because that column of knit stitches is unbroken there. That's what we want to see. Alright, we're doing good. This is a purl stitch, so we're going to go in knitwise. Knitwise into the back needle, take the stitch off. Knitwise into the next stitch, leave the stitch on. And then, right? This was a purl stitch, knitwise, knitwise. No, I'm so sorry. Alright, let's check and see where we were. This was a column of purl stitches. We went knitwise, knitwise. We need to go purlwise and purlwise. Now just a note about tension, it's easier to pull too tight on this graft than it is to do it loose. The more you practice, the easier it gets, but you can always tighten it up afterward, okay, and I'll show you how. So last stitch is going to be a knit stitch, so we're going to go in purlwise, purlwise into the back and take the stitch off, knitwise into the back stitch and leave it on, and then knitwise into the front stitch and take it off, and actually we're just going to slide both of those stitches off. This stitch is done. So we want to make sure that that yarn doesn't loop around. Okay, so here's our graft, and it came out great. That's exactly what you want to see. Okay, and then you can always tighten up if it's loose. That's no problem. You can use your tapestry needle to, like this one looks okay, but because it's like the 20th time I've done this. You can use your tapestry needle to tug the loose stitch wherever it is, and kind of feed the loose yarn over to the end, and then pull it, and it will get tighter. So that's grafting for 1x1 rib. Trying to learn and master knitting on your own is frustrating. That's why I created Knitting Superstar University, a video knitting school that teaches you everything you need to know to knit any project with confidence. Get instant access today at knitfreedom.com.